You walk into your barn on a warm summer's evening, carrying your precious loaf of blessed Lammas bread. You head to the furthest corner of your barn and carefully break off a piece of the bread and bury it in the warm earth. One by one, you do this at each corner of the barn until all four corners have a piece of bread buried in the earth. You give your thanks to the loaf and hope that this will grant you protection in the coming year against fire and grain rot. As you leave, you feel safe and contented, knowing that you have a little extra protection against the uncertainties of the winter.
Hello and welcome to the BabaYaga Project. I'm Devin and I have a master's in American History and Indigenous Studies.
I'm Sonya and I'm doing my PhD in medieval history.
We just wanted to reintroduce the project really quickly for any new subscribers. Thank you everyone for joining us on this journey. The BabaYaga Project is a podcast and soon-to-be blog, we're getting our first post up this week, about the ritualized year and its historical context. We want to explore seasonality and the cultures of Europe and North America in the context of the seasonal year. We really want to focus on historical rituals and traditions, our preconceptions of said traditions, and how they might be integrated into our contemporary lives. We think this is especially valuable given that this year has really had everyone slow down and focus on how they want to live in a new world. We hope you continue to listen, and if you really enjoy what we're doing here, consider supporting us on Patreon. It really helps us keep this going, and we really want to expand it in some super cool ways. And we also have Patreon exclusive merch. So check that out. I think it's super cool. But without further ado, today we're talking about bread. Specifically, the Lammas. Is it a festival?
Ritual, I guess? Sort of both?
The Lammas festival ritual.
Excellent.
So, clearly I don't know what this is, Sonya. Can you lay out a little bit of what Lammas is?
Absolutely. So, Lammas comes from the Anglo-Saxon hlafmas, which means loaf mass. So, this was the celebration of the first harvest of wheat in the Middle Ages in England, specifically, and it was held on August the 1st. But I do want to preface this by saying that throughout the British Isles and Europe, there would have been sort of analogous festivals and rituals celebrating at around this same time what's called sort of these feasts of first fruits. So it's this idea of this is your first harvest of the year that comes in, and you should celebrate that and be happy that you have more grain. There's, for example, in Ireland, there was a pre-Christian pagan celebration called Lunasach, which was also held at around this same time at the beginning of harvest season. And in Scotland, Lammas was one of the quarter days, which is one of the days when, rent was due, when you would go to court to settle disputes, when you would, do all these sort of ritualized, systemic structural things got done, basically.
Yeah, if you're a nerd like me and watch Outlander.
Yes.
In the first season, when Jamie gets beat up at the court, that was the quarter day.
Yes.
Yeah, just for context about Scotland, if you've seen it.
And also, we're not Outlander. Sponsor us.
Ah, yes.
We will advertise you on this as if they need us.
I love Outlander.
But,
shout out to my mom for making me read all of those books. They were great.
It's fantastic. So, yeah, I just wanted to give that nod that other places, of course, are also having similar festivities, but Lammas is, the name of the one that's going on in the British Isles, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, but also talking about bread and wheat and its position in the medieval pre-modern world more widely.
Awesome. Yeah, so like why don't we start there? Because that's sort of what we did with the last harvest festival we talked about, which was in North America, where, you know, we really contextualized it in why was corn so important. I think if you're from a Euro-Western culture like we are in Canada or North America more widely, you know that wheat's really important, but like how were people thinking about it, you know, in this historical context?
Right. So, in the historical context, throughout Europe, wheat has been that sort of that staple crop. It's the crop that you can dry out and then keep long term, which is what's allowing you to have this surplus of food, right? So this is a food that means that you don't have to, be searching for food as much, and it's something that, basically is what allows them to have settled communities. Wheat was domesticated in the Levant by around 9600 BC and reached most of Europe by 5000 BC. So it's also a crop that had been, pretty integral to the society and the culture there for a very long time. It's also very important because of its versatility. You can cook the grain just as it is. Those are known as their wheat berries, to make porridges or as an additive to soups and stews. But of course, its most common use is to grind it into flour and then make bread and pastries. It can be used to thicken soups. It was very common as food preservation as well. Early pies were actually, you wouldn't eat the crust. It was literally just something to keep like the meat and vegetables that had been cooked in it, to allow it to be portable and to keep it fresher for a little bit longer because it's cooked inside something and protected.
Huh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Like
and
totally biodegradable Tupperware.
yeah, no, it's genuinely like this would have been the medieval like McDonald's to go box. Like you would not eat it because initially pie crust was literally just water and flour, so it was pretty nasty. And it's only late, yeah, so it really wasn't edible. Like maybe if you were really desperate and like traveling on the road, you'd like eat a little of it. But yeah, for the most part, it wasn't until until people started adding things like butter to make this more flaky pastry that it actually became seen as edible.
Huh. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and even stale bread was not ever wasted. You can see that in the use of breadcrumbs and also in the medieval use as trenchers, where you would take big slices of stale bread and put that on the table, and it was essentially a biodegradable edible plate.
What?
Yeah, so you would like scoop your food onto there and eat it off your little stale bread plate, and then, you could eat your little bread plate at the end that had soaked up all the juices and sauces and stuff.
Man, we should bring this back.
I
All these zero waste blogs should really consider these medieval practices.
I mean, but really though. As we've talked about before, pre modern society was inherently zero waste because it took so much effort to make everything that like you didn't just throw things away for the most part, or if you did throw it away, it was biodegradable stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, the one other thing I wanted to point out as well is that it's not only the wheat itself that's valuable, but even the wheat stalks, because once you dry those out, they get turned into straw, which was like the all-purpose tool in the medieval world. You would use straw for animal feed, for bedding for animals. You would stuff your own mattress with it, unless you were super rich and could afford a feather bed, which, let's be real, unless you were like the king, you didn't have that. And it was also used as thatching for roofs. It could be woven into baskets. It would be used sort of mixed with, like, it in some cases is mixed with mud or with clay and then used to repair walls. So it's this kind of all-purpose, very versatile material.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And again, zero waste.
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing is wasted, and it's all, biodegradable. And I think that's something that we also don't think about is how, we tend to see things that, well, that's the way that people did it back then, which means it's bad. But, you look at a thatched roof, they last about 25 years as compared to shingles, which are terrible for the environment, maybe only last like 10 years typically.
Really, a thatched roof lasts that long?
If it's properly taken care of, it'll last that long. And it'll last even longer if you use reeds rather than straw. Reeds can apparently last up to like 70 years without needing to be replaced.
What? Wow. Sorry, my mind has been blown. I don't know anything about, like, roofing.
I mean, that's fair.
Like, wow, you just think that it would, like, because it's straw, that it would, like, break down.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to oversell its virtues. I mean, you do need to keep on top of it and swap out the parts that have maybe been, you do need to maintain your roof the same way that you would maintain any other part of your house. But yeah, for the most part, because they'd be wrapped in these really like thick, dense bundles, even through the winter and stuff, it'll keep you warm because it has that kind of it's built-in insulation as well. And because it is this natural material, like, it can slowly break down, but it's, you look at a bale of hay, I mean, those can sit out in the snow and be pretty fine.
Yeah.
Like, the main drawback, really, of thatched roofs is that it can be an issue with pest management, just because it obviously presents a very nice place for animals to live.
Yeah.
But actually, in a lot of, especially in the earlier medieval period, they had a natural way of dealing with this where you would have your fire pit in the middle of the room, and
Yeah,
you
I was
would
about to
basically,
say, if you have a fire, smoke is a natural pest repellent.
yeah. So it would not only, and get this, not only would they have the natural pest repellent, but then you could also they would also hang food from the ceiling, and then you get that natural smoky flavor in it as well because it's constantly being smoked in your house.
Ugh, that's just so good.
Yeah, it's really,
I'm
really...
officially moving out of the apartment I just moved into to build myself a hut with a thatched roof.
And again, I don't want to oversell the virtues of this. There is obviously the issue of you can be breathing in quite a lot of smoke, but at the same time, people spent a lot less time indoors.
Yeah, that's
so,
true.
To
Probably
be clear,
not ideal for a Canadian winter.
Definitely not ideal for Canadian winters, but
maybe in Vancouver.
Yeah, yeah, I think they could do fine with some thatched roofs.
Or sod, like in Iceland.
Oh, absolutely.
Anyway, back to bread.
Back to bread and wheat. So, for most people, also just to put this into perspective, from, especially in the kind of throughout Europe, really, from antiquity right through into, the Middle Ages and early modern period, for the average person, bread would be about half to 3/4 of your daily caloric intake.
Wow,
So this is a lot of you're getting a lot of bread.
So with that much, I mean, with wheat being so integral to literally every part of daily life, it seems, and bread being such a part of the diet, did wheat and bread make it into like a religious context in the way that corn did in North America?
Absolutely. In Europe, in antiquity and pre-Christianized quote-unquote Europe, you do see bread playing a role in a lot of religious rituals as an offering to different gods. and as, wheat being this very important kind of venerated food.
Yeah.
But the Christianization of Europe really, really elevates bread to a whole new status, because when Europe gets Christianized at this point, it's essentially all Catholic. And in the Catholic Church, it's, you have the body and blood of Christ is the Eucharist.
Oh,
And
right, because it's the bread.
but yeah, and it's that in Catholic understanding, there's the concept of transubstantiation.
Right.
So it's the idea that during the Mass,
Mm-hmm.
the the ritual of the Mass ends with the bread and the wine literally becoming the body and blood of Christ. So bread, when you eat it at the Mass, you are literally consuming Christ, which is obviously a big deal in
Yeah.
Christian Europe, that you can, you know, consume your God.
Yeah.
So not only is it, I mean, that's obviously the
And that
biggest.
you do it in the form of bread, which already
Yes.
has so much significance.
Exactly. So there's already so much significance to it, and there's, this idea of, God Himself took the form of bread on earth,
Right.
and that's something you do as part of your religious rituals, which I just wanted to clarify that, because I know, in a lot of Protestant churches, they do still do communion, but it's seen as like a symbolic presence in the bread, or like
Yeah.
sort of a doing this like as a, it's more of a symbolic situation. But this
Mm-hmm.
is all obviously happening pre-Protestant Reformation, where the bread is Jesus is the bread. Like, there is no separation. So that's this really special
Yeah.
thing. And
There
it's also,
there are Old Testament stories about God sending bread as well, right? With
yes,
Moses.
yeah, manna from heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Which
the
is
other big thing, is
unleavened
that,
bread, but still bread.
yeah,
Wheat.
and that's the that's the thing, is that bread in is mentioned and is very important in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. I mean, not only as the Eucharist, but also as, in the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus says, give us this day our daily bread. The time, the feeding 5,000 people with a handful of bread, loaves, and fish. Again, one of his miracles is multiplying bread so that everyone can eat.
Yeah.
So it has this very ritualized, symbolic importance in Christianity and Catholicism especially.
Mm-hmm.
So, it really elevates it, and you start to see, as societies become Christianized, they in turn put more emphasis on bread and the eating of bread, because pre-Christian, British Isles and Scandinavia, it was somewhat more, I mean, obviously they were eating grains, but they probably would have had a bit more variety,
Mm-hmm.
and a bit more of a focus on, say, cattle and milk.
Right.
But as they become Christianized, bread, like, we do see that the bread intake increases in the diet, and there's this more emphasis put on cultivating grains.
Fascinating. And so then, like, how does that? I mean, I know. So in this like Middle Ages period, early Christianization, and all of that, that there isn't really the division between religious and secular life. But if we're talking about like a more secular part of the culture, how
Yeah.
did bread become integrated into that part of the culture as well?
Right.
Because obviously it's so much importance. It's in every part of daily life, as we've made clear. What sort of happens on that side of the culture?
Well, for one thing, bread becomes a big part of your wealth and status, and you can sort of see how the quality of your bread is indicative of the status that you hold. So, nowadays we see like whole grain, artisanal, like bread with lots of seeds and stuff in it as like fancy. That would have been the bread of the poor at the
Right.
time. Because back then, white bread, I mean, it's not Wonder Bread. It would have been more like a French
Brioche.
loaf or Italian loaf. Yeah, something like that. Would have been only available to very high status, wealthy people because that takes so much extra labor to remove all the wheat bran and grind it and have this, you're wasting a lot of the wheat basically. And it takes a lot of time and effort and energy to get that very white flour. So we see this division where like the lower down you were in society, kind of the more coarse your bread would be and the more non-wheat additives you'd have in it.
Right.
So you'd probably be eating wheat mixed with barley or rye, or maybe you're throwing in some legumes to fill it out a bit. So that's a big part of it. But the other big thing is bread, and the eating of bread was to an extent seen as a marker of being quote unquote civilized.
Oof.
Yes. So we see this actually in the Mediterranean basin since antiquity. When Homer is writing, he calls his own people bread eaters, as opposed to the barbarians who do not rely on bread as much. So that's, we already have this sort of undercurrent in the cultural perception of it. But then, as I said, bread gets this very elevated status in the medieval world. And, by the time you're in the 12th century, you have Gerald of Wales writing about people who are more pastoral and nomadic, saying, "They are a wild and inhospitable people. They live on beasts only and live like beasts. They have not progressed at all from the primitive habits of pastoral living."
Ooh.
Yeah, so he's writing that in about 1188.
Okay.
So yeah, you're really, I mean, obviously that is one person writing, but there is this broader trend that we see of wheat equals civilization.
Right.
And it's these combination of cultural and religious practices that really encourage this specific European style of agriculture where, you clear the land, you drain the marsh, you clear cut the forest, and then you plant tidy little rows, right? You have to cultivate grain and have, nice, neat field systems. And this was seen as, I mean, literally as doing God's work, because by by around, let's say, year 1200-ish, probably actually even earlier than that, really, by 1000, you're already seeing these kinds of attitudes of, there's this idea that the land is, you don't want to leave land as an untamed wilderness, because then that means that it's in disorder and it's in chaos, and that as human beings, since you are directed to, have dominion over the earth, the way that you are supposed to do that in the medieval imagination is to bring the land into submission, basically,
Right.
and bring it under cultivation. So we have a passage like this from William of Malmesbury in 1125, and he's describing an abbey, a Thorney Abbey, which was surrounded by swamps, but wrote, "No part of the land, however tiny, is uncultivated. In one place you come across fruit trees, in another fields bordered with vines. Nature and art are in competition. What the one forgets the other brings forth. It is the image of paradise, and its loveliness gives an advanced idea of heaven itself.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's this huge overlap of this idea that turning take if especially you see this in monastic communities, this idea that, you know, it is your job to go out into the wilderness, so places like a swamp, but then bring it under cultivation. You're supposed to drain the land and make it arable land, because that means that you are participating in creation and you're participating in, you know, literally making the world the way that God wanted it to be, basically. So, yeah, I mean, bringing this back to the North American context and South American context also, for a hot second, this is the vestiges of this are still around when colonization is taking place. So this is sort of the mentality that that we see with this idea of, well, you're not using the land correctly, which means in the European style of agriculture, so therefore it's okay for us to take this land and use it properly, quote unquote.
Yeah, that was a major thing, like heading toward removal, that like the Cherokee in particular, in like the negotiations with the new American state, was trying to convince Cherokee men to like one, have individual plots of land, but two, to like take up this Euro-Western style of agriculture in order to prove to the American state that in the ideas of what constituted a nation in Europe, that like the Cherokee had a nation there, right? That they had a right to the land because they were cultivating it. It ended up not proving anything to the American state because they didn't care and just wanted to take all of the land anyway.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
it was a big part. There was a whole like movement, agricultural movement within the Cherokee Nation that was kind of fascinating in the early 19th century.
Yeah, and I mean it's very much like, I mean, not the individual plots of land, that wouldn't come around for quite a
Yeah.
while, but yeah, I mean this idea that, you know, the correct way to use the land is European style
Mm-hmm.
agriculture, and that anything else is wrong and is wasting the productivity of the land is, you know, something that's been around since, you know, the medieval era.
Oh,
So that's this
productivity.
like really entrenched belief system.
Everything you do has to be economically productive.
Yeah, and it's frustrating as well because, I mean, in many ways Europe is, I mean, that style of farming works in the context of the European subcontinent.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't do so hot in many other types of biomes. So it is problematic, to say the least.
Yeah, well, and also like once you start getting out of that type of agriculture for subsistence versus like massive industrial agriculture that started in the 19th
Yeah.
century, you really that push toward productivity becomes completely destructive as well. So
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, not to, you know, not trying to say, well, the older ways are always better, but you know, in terms of the agriculture in the Middle Ages, I will at least say that there isn't, you know, it's very different from the kind of agribusiness
yeah,
that we're seeing today, right? It's, yes, you're clearing land and cultivating it, but also, you know, it's still much less disruptive than what we're seeing today,
yeah. Well,
and
I mean the
it's much less of this like push towards like, well, you have to, extract every possible little thing out of the land.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a 18th, I guess, yeah, I would argue like 18th century like plantation farming is where that really starts to develop once you have the large plantations of
Yeah.
the Caribbean and southern American colonies. That really, once you get to like a Victorian period, mid 19th century America, that's where that what we see now in this like agribusiness really comes from. But I mean, like, then you trace it back,
Yeah.
to its like original roots, and we see it here. That's oof. A big legacy for bread.
It really is, and it's this very I do think it's interesting to kind of go back and see where these ideas that we just sort of take for granted come from, as we've talked about before.
Yeah.
This idea of like what we take for granted, that like, oh yeah, of course you have to farm this specific way, and it's like, well, do you though? Because a lot of people weren't doing that, or if they were, it was being done in this much more like mixed agriculture kind of way, like as we see in that quote that I said before, right? He's talking about how they have fruit trees, fields bordered with vines. So it's, you're growing in this same small area,
all sorts of different
fruit trees, so some kind of orchards, you're growing vines, so I'm guessing grapes, because you could actually grow grapes in this more southern parts of England in this period because it was warmer. And then, yeah, probably the vines bordering fields of likely wheat or legumes. So, it is this idea of cultivating the earth can be this thing that gives you power over it, but that is also done in a way that also brings, that's also not so devastating to the natural ecosystem.
Yeah, and I mean, like, the argument for contemporary, like, agribusiness is always like, well, there's so many people that we have to feed, but if we look at, like, the industrialized countries where there is, like, this massive agribusiness, like, half of all the food that's produced in North America is thrown away because capitalism. So, like, you have to, have capital up front to purchase the food, right?
Yeah.
And so most of it gets, a solid half of all the food that's produced in North America gets thrown away. It ends up in landfills. Like, we have more than enough resources to feed everyone, like, twice over. We choose not to. And part of that is because of this, like, productivity concept, and that things have to be worth money, right?
Well, and also then we have the fun, the passing the blame onto the individual and saying, well, there's so much food waste because, you let some of that lettuce wilt in the back of your fridge, and it's your fault that we have so much food waste. And it's like, no, like, no human being can perfectly plan out their meals such that no food is ever going to be wasted ever. Like,
and I mean, people didn't do that in this society either. They still had composting and fertilizer and...
Exactly, and, like, that's just sort of the how food works. I mean, some of it is going to go bad before you get around to eating it. But yeah, I think, again, it's this sort of hyper focus on the individual and on individual responsibility that creates a lot of problems because, food waste is a systemic problem. It is a problem that's caused by... Yeah, and I would argue even more so, like, it's a societal problem, but it's a problem caused by a handful of very wealthy, powerful people who demand constant increase in profits for food, basically.
Yeah. Which I think is, like, the major difference between what we're talking about in like productivity culture here in the Middle
Yeah.
Ages and productivity culture now, where it's like, yes, you're supposed to be like have the land produce for you, but not to the point that like you're decimating the land in order to extract absolutely everything from everything.
Yeah, and then throwing away half of it because it won't make you money anyways.
Yeah.
Whereas, yeah, no, I mean, here you would be using, as I was saying earlier in this episode, from wheat, obviously, you're using absolutely everything. But the same for any other fruits and vegetables you would produce. You would use as much of it as you possibly could. And, we see this in, okay, well, we're going to grow grapes and we're going to eat some of them, and the rest gets turned into wine. We're going to, grow fruits. Well, we're going to cook and eat because for the most, I mean, people ate raw fruit in the Middle Ages, but it was seen as like not the best thing. It was seen as better to cook it first,
Yeah.
because it would make it easier to digest.
And you
But
can keep it for longer. Fruit goes bad
yeah,
so quickly.
exactly. And then you also see, all kinds of preservation techniques to keep, whether it's jams or preserves or turning apples into cider, and any kind of food waste would be turned, like, say apple cores
Mm-hmm.
or, things like that. As you said earlier, people would turn that into compost, or
Vinegar,
you could,
animal
yeah,
feed.
and you can also feed it to the animals. So, yeah, it is this idea of, yes, you want the land to be productive, but there was also much more of a, waste not, want not mentality. Like, you did not throw away things. There was that real respect for never wasting anything ever, basically.
And I mean, correct me if I'm like taking this too far, but that seems to fit into the religiosity of the period as well, with the idea of the productivity of the land, where like humans have dominion over the earth, but it's in the, if you look at Genesis and like the Garden of Eden, it's as stewards of the land, right? Where
Yes.
you're supposed to cultivate the land, but as like God's hands on earth. So you wouldn't be throwing away God's creations just because it's not making you money.
Yeah, absolutely not. Wasteful, like being wasteful like that would be seen as sinful,
Yeah.
essentially. I mean, genuinely, yeah, not even essentially, it would be seen as just a
Yeah,
sin to
as
do
that's part
something like that.
of gluttony, isn't it? Like if you look at Dante.
Yeah, it's definitely part of gluttony, and also part of
Yeah.
greed. To that's, yeah, because there is this religiosity of the period that it kind of does lead to that, like, yes, we are going to transform this wetland, or this other like wilderness as they would have called
Mhm.
it, but there is that respect for, like, this is God's creation and we are participating in that creation, and they saw it as, like I said, literally doing God's work, in that you would bring this land under cultivation and then use the fruits of that land. And there's a lot of, giving thanks for the bounty that the land would give you, and that's, brings us right up to Lammas, which is, this religious ritualized celebration of the first harvest of wheat.
Yeah, and so now that we've come back around to our actual topic for today, what does the ritual of Lammas actually look like? What do people do?
Right. So on Lammas, the first thing you would be doing is preparing a loaf of bread that was made with the flour from the newly harvested wheat. So you would mix that up, and then, depending on context, either bake it, depending on the type of bread you're making, you'd probably take it to the village baker to actually fully bake in their bread oven. Or, I guess in some cases you're maybe baking bread like on a stone over a fire in your own hearth, depending on basically the situation and the exact, you know, place, because obviously from like village to village, how you're doing this is going to differ. But then you would typically have then these processions to the church, to the local village church with everyone in the village, and they would bring the bread to be blessed. And again, there's some regional variation on this. In some cases, the Lammas bread would be left at the altar, and then that would be kind of dried out and saved to be bread for communion for the coming year.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so it's this idea of renewal and of bringing in these first fruits of the land into the church to be blessed. But in other cases, you would go home with your own loaves of bread, and that's actually what my story was at the beginning of this podcast. It comes from a protective ritual that's described in a book of Anglo-Saxon charms. And what you would do is take your lammas bread and break 4 pieces off of it and bury it in the 4 corners of the barn, in order to protect all the grain that you would be storing in the barn.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and it's very much this ritual it's one of the oldest points of contact between the agricultural world and the church. So that's, it's one of the first kind of links that forms. There are some other ones that happen later, but that's sort of the big one. And then, for the most part, after this, there would be feasting and festivities and just kind of an all-round good time where you would get to eat at least some of the blessed bread, and there's records of different types of games that would be played, there'd be music, and the biggest part of this is, of course, all the feasting. And as with, essentially every part of medieval life, the meal was a big communal affair. So your entire household, or if you are in your village, you go to the lord's, you'd go to the long house, and the entire household, all the people, all the peasants, including servants, and everyone would dine together at a big communal table.
Aww.
And it was so it's everyone coming together in the community, and this was the case for basically the entirety of the Middle Ages. So yeah, this is sort of quite consistent throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages, that for these feasts and meals, people take them together in the Great Hall.
Yeah.
There isn't this, it was seen as very very egotistical and very haughty, for you to sneak off and just have private company, and it was seen as kind of suspicious, as well, why are you going off to eat by yourself just because that's very strange in this world. It's not normal.
I love communal meals. I think that's just such a wonderful way of building community.
Yeah, and it's also really nice in that it's a way to ensure that everyone in the village basically is getting fed, is getting the same quality of food, is getting the same variety of food, at least on these feast days, right?
Community care.
And yeah, exactly. So it's community care, and it's this idea of sharing in the abundance of what you have, and that acknowledging that you all need each other, that this isn't yes, there is this hierarchy in the medieval world, and I'm not going to pretend there isn't, but there is also this acknowledgement that we have mutual obligations to each other, and even if you are a higher status person, that understanding that you absolutely need all the other people in this hierarchy, and that you shouldn't look down your nose at people who are essential workers.
Right. Build a longer table.
Exactly. Build a longer table, not a higher wall.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I guess I'll start with the question of, like, is Lammas still practiced in the British Isles? Because that's where my people are from, and I had never heard of this before.
To an extent, yes. There are still parishes that will do some kind of observance on Lammas and bless the bread. And, to my understanding, there are still in some communities like some version of a Lammas like harvest festival ish thing. And in some cases, Lammas is observed as part of, to my understanding, like part of neo paganism or other sort of wheel of the year traditions, but
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely not widely observed the way it would have once been.
Okay. And why do you have any, like, historical clues as to why it's not as widely celebrated? I mean, other than, like, a general secularization.
Well, I think a big part of it is, of course, the general secularization, but also we still have records talking about people celebrating this quite widely, like into the 19th century, and it seems like this has sort of dwindled down as more and more urbanization happened, and there was less agrarian sort of celebrations just more generally.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the other big thing is that even by then it had become much less celebrated than it had once been, and I really think that a big part of that is this increasing moves towards hyper individualization and towards a more distinct separation of people in society, because towards the end of the Middle Ages we do start to see this shift of the wealthy and the powerful increasingly moving away from this collective community experience. So, whenever possible, these rich hosts would go with their consort and maybe like a handful of hand picked people to go and eat their meals in the Lord's chambers. So, this
Right.
turned into this great privilege to be, in the Lord's presence, because then this is a way to keep, well, you can reward your allies, you can reward, certain subordinates while you snub others. And it allows the wealthy to distance themselves further and further from the household and from the wider community and keep all the luxury foods to themselves and just sort of give inferior food to everyone else in the Great Hall.
Right. So that's when we see, like, the intense class stratification that continues to affect Great Britain.
Yes, that's definitely where you start seeing, the seeds of the really intense class differentiation.
Okay.
And Lammas and a lot of other festivals and feast days that normally would have been celebrated communally in the Great Hall. In general, we see a dwindling of this into, either obscurity or into much smaller, more modest celebrations, because you don't have this, you no longer have the Lord of the Manor basically putting on a big party for everyone, and instead just retreats into privacy all the time.
Right. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's sad. Obviously, I really want to reiterate that I am not here to say the Middle Ages were great and perfect. But I do think that there's value
If for
in...
nothing else, there's antibiotics now.
Exactly. Definitely I would prefer to be living in a world with, like, antibiotics and electricity than the Middle Ages, but I do think that dismissing everything in the past whole cloth and saying, well, it was all bad and terrible is also unfair. And I think that there are nice things that can be taken from this idea of community and sharing and celebrating things together.
Yeah, and I mean, so to sort of wrap this up, we've talked about two major harvest festivals on either side of the world. I guess, do you want to sort of start us off on what we, as, you know, modern contemporary people who we specifically are living in an urban setting, what we can take from looking at these major religious harvest festivals?
Well, I think the first thing we can take away is this focus on community care and on sharing with others, whether that means, you know, obviously right now things are a little bit crazy. You can't, you know, it's not like you can go and please don't host a giant house party. But
understatement of the year.
but I do think that, you know, there's something to be said about focusing on that community care. If you're able to, giving money and especially your time to organizations like soup kitchens or food banks that can really use it right now. But
mutual aid groups.
Yeah, mutual aid. Even something as simple as gathering people who you know and saying, let's have, you know, a picnic in the park, potluck situation so everyone gets to eat kind of deal.
Yeah.
Like
socially
check in.
Distanced, obviously. Sit 6 feet apart.
Please socially distance, wear a mask, but, you know, checking in even informally with friends, with family, with your neighbors, and, you know, making sure everyone's eating.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the things that I've really been thinking about as we've started researching for these 2 episodes, is the idea that they really focus around, and especially at least what I took from my research on the green corn ceremony, was this idea of ritualized gratitude.
Yes.
Of, like, we have this harvest and we have this abundance now. We need to be thankful for, one, what went into creating it with the green corn ceremony, with, like, the idea that so much work and labor, and as we talk about, like, mutual aid and care in North America right now, especially, there's a lot of news stories that are focusing on migrant workers who harvest food in North America. What goes into getting your food, but also the process of making your food, and taking, even if it's an individual moment, taking a moment to be grateful for what the world can provide, and to just enjoy things, you know, to not have to take a moment to just enjoy a bounty and not produce something, you know, not be part of the economy, to, you know, if you're making your own bread or something like that, to just make something for you and your community to enjoy. If you're in a place where you can, in Canada, you can have your social bubble, you know, your 3 households that can share community germs, having, or at a picnic, you know, having a shared meal can be a really powerful way to focus on gratitude.
Yeah, and I think there's something very, very powerful also in, as you said, taking that moment to just enjoy things and be thankful for what we have, and to share that bounty with others, rather than kind of scarfing down your food really fast and then going on to the next task because you have to be so productive all the time. Like,
Yeah.
I think taking this time, it's in its own way kind of a a rejection of this, like, you always have to be, burning the candle at both ends and, hustle, grind till you die mentality, and saying, no, I'm going to appreciate what's in front of me right now.
And like
And yeah.
not counting your food as just sustenance. It's something that is on some level, I mean, possibly, like, if you don't practice a religion, like, it's fine, but like in a even in a natural way is kind of miraculous, that
Yeah.
food can be so good. Don't count calories, is what I'm saying. Just eat because food is good, and take time to, like, really prepare food if you can, obviously. But, like,
Yeah, and that's actually something else I wanted to, uh, shameless self promotion, but we're going to be sharing a bunch of recipes for different types of bread that are, very low effort but very tasty, and they don't take a lot of time. So it's something that I've found very therapeutic through lockdown, as obviously many others have,
yeah.
is, kind of being involved in the process of making my own food,
Mm-hmm.
in that way. Because I mean, obviously I was cooking stuff before the lockdown, but bread always seemed so difficult and finicky, and I don't know what to do. So I have found a lot of it feels very, very nice to have made a nice loaf of bread, and mine's a no knead recipe. So
Yeah.
it's something that even if you are busy and trying to juggle 100 things, you can still have that moment, those few minutes of quiet in your day where you're mixing up this dough and watching it rise.
Yeah, it can be really powerful. Same with just even if you have, like, really limited space, like I do in my urban apartment, you can grow and cultivate some of your own food, even if it's just herbs or just a plant. Maybe one that doesn't, like, produce something edible, but I think that can be a really powerful way to connect to the seasons and to, you know, your food and sustenance is just growing a couple of things.
Yeah. And I think on that note, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who's been tuning in, listening, subscribing. Um, and there is, an ancient tradition in many parts of Europe. Again, I'm getting the Ukrainian context specifically through my family lineage, where it was traditional to welcome people into your home with bread and salt, which were, kind of the foundations of life. And as my end to this episode, I just want to let you know that we might not be able to be there, in person, especially in a pandemic, but there is bread and salt for you here. And I hope you enjoy your stay with us.
Yeah, and we're gonna post on the blog and on social media as well. And if you do try any of these things, or if you have ways that you're thinking about harvest and bounty, as summer sort of comes to a close, let us know. Reach out. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to find out what everyone is doing, to integrate some of these ideas into their daily life, and anything that we can learn from you guys. Like we said in our very first episode, this is a learning process for us as well. We're doing so much research every episode, so it would just be really cool to hear from anyone who's listening. Thank you so much, and in the spirit of ancient hospitality rituals, there's the very old Abrahamic ritual of leaving a candle in the window to let travelers know that they're welcome here, and along with our bread and salt, we have a candle burning in our window for you guys. So thank you so much for listening. Again, if you can reach out to a mutual aid foundation, please do that. And if on top of that you have anything for Patreon support, we would greatly appreciate it. And just be able to, with that, we'd be able to put more and more resources into this project. Thank you so much. Do good work.
And we'll see you next week.